And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather for the marine section of our forecast for April 7th. Starting off, we'll take a look at our ice edge. We can still see some breaks up in the Norton Sound area, as well as many breaks down into the Bristol Bay area and just north of the Pribilof Islands and along the coast as well. Taking a look now, quick recap focusing on the marine weather on Monday. Low pressure out in the Gulf of Alaska is going to bring southerly winds out over the Panhandle area, including quite a bit of moisture, especially rain at the lower elevations. And then out over the west coast, we do have northerly flow coming down. It's going to be a little bit stronger, pushing in some of that strong winds through the gaps of the Alaska Peninsula as well, expecting to see some gustier winds on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. Then as we move into Tuesday, continuing to see low pressure out over the Gulf of Alaska waters, more southerly flow headed towards the Panhandle area. On the backside of the Gulf flow, we're going to see more northerly winds coming through the Alaska Peninsula. And we have another system coming in from the west that's going to bring some stronger winds out by the western Aleutian Islands and western portions of the Bering Sea. So taking a look now at the marine forecast, starting off in southeast Alaska on Monday. Southerly winds out over the Gulf waters around 20 knots there, seas at about 11 feet. South to southeast winds in the inside waters 15 to 20 knots expected there. Seas up to as high as 8 feet in the southern portions of the inner waters. Then as we move into Tuesday, continue to be south to southeast, but dropping down to 10 to 15 knots in the inside waters and southerly winds around 15 knots in the Gulf waters. For Monday, for south central areas, looking at more northerly winds, 15 to 20 knots over much of the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska. Prince William Sound, 15 knots out of the northwest. Northerly winds in the Cook Inlet area, 10 knots picking up to 15 knots in southern locations. Strongest winds are going to be by the Barren Islands, around 30 knots out of a northwest direction. As we move into Tuesday, still somewhat northerly in the Cook Inlet area, 20 knots expected there. Still somewhat of a northerly component on the western side of the Barren Islands, around 25 knots, but switching to be more southeasterly as we get out over the Gulf waters, 20 knots in the western portions, increasing up to 30 knots in the northern portions, and even 25 knots moving into Prince William Sound. As we look down over Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, starting off by Kodiak Island, we're going to see westerly winds 25 to 30 knots, gust up to 45 knots in Shelikof Strait out of some of the channeled areas. Out over the Alaska Peninsula, we're going to see northwesterly winds around 30 knots. Some areas getting up to as high as gale force at 35 knots, but we're going to see those gusty winds on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula up to as high as 50 knots as we get closer towards Chignik. Then on Tuesday, staying out of that northwesterly direction, 30 knots on the Bering side, getting up to as high as 40 knots out of that northwesterly direction as we get closer towards Kodiak Island. But around Kodiak, it's going to be 30 to 35 knots out of that northwest direction. For the Aleutian Islands, on Monday, northwesterly winds 25 to 30 knots out by the eastern Aleutians, dropping down to 20 knots for the central Aleutians and 15 knots by the western Aleutians. But as we move into Tuesday, with that next system coming up in the western part of the Bering Sea, we are going to see stronger winds coming in out of the south, around 40 knots there. Then as we get by the central Aleutian Islands, dropping down to 20 to 25 knots out of a more westerly direction, and then staying out of the west, 25 knots for the eastern Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast, seeing primarily northerly flow, 25 to 30 knots along much of the coastline, and 20 knots by St. Matthew Island, 25 knots by the Pribilof Islands. I do want to mention that south of Nunavik Island towards the Bristol Bay area on Monday and on Tuesday, we are going to have the potential for some extreme freezing spray once we get from the ice edge in areas farther to the south. Again, on Tuesday, going to keep those stronger northwesterly winds south of Nunavik Island into Bristol Bay. Again, possibility for extreme freezing spray here on Monday and Tuesday down into Bristol Bay. Out by the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island, westerly winds 20 to 25 knots, and then weaker north of Nunavik Island, only 10 knots out of the west. On Monday, along the Arctic coast, I'm going to see northwesterly winds 15 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots by Kaktovik. And then along the west coast, northerly winds 20 knots, picking up to 30 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait. For Tuesday, pretty light winds up along much of the Arctic coastline, finally picking up to 15 knots by Kaktovik out of a northwesterly direction, and then starting to become more southerly or southeasterly along the west coast, 10 to 15 knots, picking up to 20 knots by the Bering Strait. With Alaska Weather and your marine forecast, thanks for watching. I'm David Kramer.